Thank you to Ohuhu for sponsoring today's video and for providing me these new markers for me to try out. Hello friends, I hope that you've been well. As you may have guessed from the title and thumbnail of this video, I will be creating some illustrations based on some sets of emojis. Over on Instagram a number of weeks ago, I had asked my followers to give me a set of 3 emojis to use in today's video, and while there were so many great options, I narrowed it down to 2 for today, and I did take screenshots of a variety of them, and I had a lot of fun creating these, so I will probably do more in the future. So for the first illustration, we have a clown, a piece of cake, and a pink ribbon. I picked this one because I felt like the 3 emojis really felt so cohesive together in terms of theme and aesthetic. Plus, I actually really love illustrating cute clown girls, so I was really excited to have an excuse to draw a cute clown girl again. And yeah, you know, there's just so much you can do in terms of makeup, costuming, and color palettes. So as you can see, to begin, I did the sketch digitally on my iPad using Procreate. I immediately knew I wanted the clown character to be eating a slice of cake, and I decided to go in a very light-hearted, fun direction, giving her a kind of pin-up / Betty Boop style expression as she's about to eat some cake. And during this stage, I also plan out roughly what kind of color palette I want to use. And of course, the pink bow was where I started. And then from there, I decided to go for like a very muted pastel color palette with pops of red. So for those of you who are familiar with my previous Ohuhu marker videos, you'll probably know that I typically work with their brush tip markers, and they are dual tips, so one side is brush tip and the other side is chisel. The brush tip side is the side that I typically use, which has like a flexible tapered nib. However, this new set that I was sent to try, it actually has a chisel and a fine tip nib. So for the majority of these illustrations, I use the fine tip because I just find it gives me much more precision when it comes to staying within my line art, even though technically the chisel tip is faster in terms of getting larger areas of space covered, but I just find that I'm not very good at controlling the chisel tip, and I find that I just get a lot of inconsistencies and I get out of my line art. So as you can see throughout the process, I typically approach the flat areas of color by outlining the shape first, and then I fill it in, often with like a consistent vertical strokes or lines, but there definitely are cases throughout the process where I get a little bit impatient with my coloring, and so I just sort of like scribble it in. And then for like really large areas like the background, I tried a different technique which I actually had picked up from Re Artwork, I think is their handle on YouTube. I'll have their handle on the screen here for you. They do tons of marker illustrations on their YouTube channel, and a technique that they use to fill in large areas is a kind of swirly scribbly motion, which creates a kind of more seamless look in terms of avoiding any streaks. But I did find that kind of hurt my wrist over a period of time, so I kind of flip-flop between all of these different types of techniques because honestly, I'm not overly concerned about the surfaces being perfectly flat. Oftentimes I use colored pencils on top anyways. And then here actually for the tutu, the crinoline or tulle part of the skirt, I ended up going in a fanning out direction so that it matched the direction that the tulle would be kind of poofing out from her waist. So that in that case, I did use the direction of the strokes to my advantage. But for a lot of the other areas, I just sort of filled it in however I was feeling, I guess. But I will say when it comes to kind of mid-tone or darker areas, I've said this in previous videos before, but if you find that it's really patchy or really streaky, then you can always go over it a second time or even a third time to even it out. And I find that usually does the trick. So you'll see that in the background here, I used that scribbly circly motion, and I ended up doing that I think twice for the background. I didn't film all of it just because it's a bit repetitive looking and tedious, but I found that really helped getting a fairly even kind of wash, I guess, for the entire area. Then, after filling in the background, it was on to some shading. With my marker illustrations, I don't often go for a gradient or that like super blended manga style shading, and especially when it comes to using nibs that are not a brush tip, I decided to go for a more cell shading / graphic look instead. Many of the elements here I have this kind of muted lavender for the shading, which I think creates a nice contrast to the skin tone and the pink elements, but I also find it makes it feel a little bit more cohesive with the color of the tulle skirt and the color of her hair. And then for the shadows on the yellow outfit, I decided to go with a pink instead of using that purple again because I just felt like it created a nice contrast. And I also find that using the pink on the yellow just keeps that element still warm as opposed to using the purple on it, and it helps tie into the pink elements on the rest of her outfit as well. I often get questions about how I pick my color palettes, and while I do find that planning my colors in advance digitally on my iPad make a huge difference, I do find that trying to limit your color palette makes a big difference as well. And in that same vein, I also advise to try and carry all the different colors throughout the piece to create a sense of harmony, like how I used the lavender pink for the shading to tie everything together. And another thing that I wanted to be conscious of was the use of that pop of red. It is quite a strong color in comparison to the rest of the piece, and so I didn't want it to be too overbearing because I wanted the overall, feel of the piece to be like very light and pastel. So I tried to use that red pretty sparingly. And I did make a point to place a couple of the decorative stars to be red around her to help carry the eye around the piece so that your eyes don't just zone in and only focus on the little strawberry on the cake and her lips. And then here you can see I am now going in with a variety of different fine liners to finish out the line art. And lately I've been really enjoying using a bunch of different colored fine liners for this step. I find that it's really just adds an extra little oomph because, as you may have guessed, I love color, and so as opposed to just using a black or just using one color to outline everything, I do think that it creates like a slight extra sense of interest by varying the colors of the lines depending on the element that is being that's getting the line art. And then I did go in with a little bit of colored pencil, mostly on the hair and the skin. I didn't want to go fully into rendering mode with the colored pencils. That's usually the way that I approach my market illustrations, but there was something kind of charming about just the very kind of flat and really graphic look of this piece. So I decided to go pretty sparingly with the colored pencils this time, and I think that it creates for a really nice illustrative look. And I did use the white paint marker just for the little shine in her eyes and on her lips, which is always my favorite little touch to add to any illustration. Then moving on to the next set of emojis, we've got a sword, a snake, and an apple. For this, I initially started out with a rough sketch in my sketchbook that I took a photo of on my iPad and then used it as a base for when I started to work on this digitally. These emojis immediately stood out for me because I felt like it was telling me a story already with these themes. A sword, of course, makes me think of a knight, and for those of you who are familiar with my work on Instagram, you'll know that I absolutely love illustrating female knights and warriors. But then there's also that added layer of intrigue with the snake and the apple, which of course makes me think of the story of Adam and Eve, with the snake tempting Eve with an apple. You know the story. So with all of these things in mind, I decided to illustrate Eve as a knight stabbing an apple with the sword and the snake kind of wrapping around it. I think that it makes for a really interesting motif and allows for all of you as the viewer to interpret it however you would like. So for this color palette, I knew that red was going to come into play for the apple, and to try and find ways to tie in the red throughout the piece, I gave her red lips as well as ginger hair. And then when it came to the rest of the color palette, I thought of how the complementary color to orange is blue, and then the complementary color to red is green, and thus I landed on giving the rest of the illustration a very teal/turquoise heavy vibe. This sketch definitely has a sense of drama with the wind-swept hair and this pose, so I decided to go for 2 different colored light sources for an additional added flair. So the left side, I have a light yellow color coming through, and then the right side, I have a light blue kind of color light happening. And I add those bits in first so that I know where to color around when I start adding in the local colors. And something that I was able to take advantage of with this huge set of colors is that this marker set has a very wide range of grays, including a handful of green grays. And it's exactly how it sounds. They're grays that lean a little bit green. And this ended up being the perfect shade for the armor in this illustration so that it would tie into the teal/turquoise heavy color palette. I was also able to get a nice range of shades to create the shine on the metal of the armor, which was very satisfying. And I started out with the base color and I drew around where I wanted the brightest highlights to be so that the paper would serve as the highlight. And then I did use a very light green around the highlights to kind of create almost like a glowing effect, and just to emphasize that I wanted the armor to have that slight green hue to it. And then from there, I use a darker green-gray marker to create the shadows and give the armor some dimension. And then after that, I do go back in with the base color green-gray to create a more gradual color shift into the shadow areas. Because I did find that the step from the base gray to the darker gray, a pretty big jump. So I find that going in with a second pass with that base color helps kind of tie them in a little bit more seamlessly. And that's the benefit of using alcohol markers, is that you can layer the same color on top of one another to create darker shades. Then it was on to the background. I picked out 3 or 4 markers in advance that roughly matched up with colors I used in my digital mockup, but I accidentally started out with the wrong shade, which you can see me here switch partway through for this kind of cloudy smoke element. Later on, I end up fixing it with some colored pencil, so it's not such a stark contrast in that little spot. It's like Bob Ross says, there's no mistakes, just happy accidents. And then, we just find ways to try and cover it up. I'm sure if I didn't say anything, probably no one would have even noticed. So anyways, I wanted there to be a slight gradient in the background where the top is lighter and then it gets darker as we reach the bottom. And creating gradients with a fine tip and chisel tip alcohol marker is not an easy task, but I figured I would give it the old college try anyways. So I picked 3 different shades of teal/turquoise and switched between them as I made my way down the background area. After I finish this first pass, I end up going over the entire thing a second time with 1 teal marker to help with these very stark transitions and even out any obvious patchiness. Overall, the gradient is quite subtle, but I do think that it is a little bit more interesting than one solid shade of teal or blue. And as you can see here, I am going in with that kind of circly, scribbly motion. And yeah, I find that it creates an interesting kind of look. It's not perfect, obviously, in terms of the evenness or the flatness of the area, but I do end up going over this entire area again with some colored pencils anyway, and I do think that it makes for kind of an interesting texture. And then here you can see I'm now adding in the shading on the hair, and similar to the previous illustration, I decided to just stick with a very kind of cell shaded graphic look. And then for an added bit of fun, I decided to go in with this Winsor & Newton gold ink and a teeny tiny paintbrush to add in some gold accents to the sword and the pattern on the armor. And I think that it really just helps the armor pop and makes the piece feel a little bit more extra, a little bit more luxurious, and I just love adding a little bit of shine to my illustration, so this was the perfect opportunity. And I will say that this Ohuhu marker paper is really good at holding like a wet medium, at least to this capacity where it's like pretty minimal, because it is like a slightly heavier weight kind of Bristol paper, which I do really like, because it allows me to kind of experiment with gold ink and adding paint markers and things like that, which I really appreciate, because if you're familiar with typical marker paper, it's usually quite thin. So I really do like that this Ohuhu marker paper is on the thicker side. And then here you can see I'm now going in with my Fineliners to add in the liner, and like the previous illustration, I am mixing up the colors depending on the element. So any of the warm elements such as her skin and her hair, I use like a brown and a red, and then for the armor and the snake, I go in with a blue. Earlier, when I was coloring in the background, I accidentally colored in an area that wasn't meant to be blue, and you can see here I'm using my white paint marker to fix that area, which worked pretty well actually, which I was kind of impressed by. And then I'm going in with this red, brown, maroon color for some of the armor, just to create a slightly heavier line and darker value on certain areas to make them pop out a little bit better. And then I also go in with a little bit of color pencil on her face and her hair, and then I create this fun texture on the chainmail part of her armor, just kind of like a pattern. And then I am now going into the background using a variety of greens and blues, and I use a little bit of black for that background, which creates just this like really satisfying colored pencil texture. And I use the black just around the actual knight and snake and sword so that they stand out against the background just a little bit. And yeah, that comes to the end of this video. I hope that you enjoyed seeing both of these characters come to life based off of the emojis that were given to me by a couple of my followers. Let me know which one was your favorite of the two. They definitely have two completely different vibes, but I think that's what is fun about my work, is that I like to explore all sorts of different moods and aesthetics. And yeah, let me know if you want to see more of these. I definitely have tons of emojis saved on my iPad from the previous suggestions. So let me know if you want to see another video like this, and I'll be happy to do that in the future. Anyways, thank you so much for watching, and I hope that you have an amazing day or evening wherever you're at, and I'll see you next time. Bye!